Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. On the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks, Israelis hold memorials to honor the victims of the deadly assault as Hamas targets Tel Aviv with rockets. At least 9 Palestinian children are among the 17 people killed after the Israeli military orders civilians to flee Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza before carrying out strikes. And Israel continues its bombardment of the Lebanese capital as Hezbollah targets Haifa. Hello and welcome. On the one-year anniversary of the deadly October 7th attacks, Hamas has escalated tensions by launching a significant volley of rockets aimed at Tel Aviv. This came as Israelis across the country held memorials to honor and mourn the victims of last year's deadly assault. Well, the Hamas-led attacks of the 7th of October resulted in the deaths of 1,139 people and the abduction of 250 others, of whom 100 are still thought to be in Gaza. Well, families of those who were abducted and killed at the Supernova Festival in Israel gathered at the site of that attack to remember their loved ones today. Well, journalist Noga Tarnopolsky joins us now from Jerusalem. Noga, thank you very much for speaking to us once again here. Just tell us how today's somber anniversary has been marked there.
Well, it's a very grim day. More than 130 rockets have landed in Israel at the same time that, as you said, people are gathered in hundreds of different ceremonies. Some are neighborhood ceremonies, some are, for example, at the Nova festival or at various different communities that were ravaged. And the largest ceremony is underway right now as we speak in Tel Aviv's Hayakon Park, with about 40,000 people present, which is a lot less than half of those who intended to go. But because of the security situation, the Israeli army limited the amount of people who could attend.
We've talked in recent months about how politically divided Israel has become. But in terms of today, would you say the country was entirely united in its sense of grief?
Absolutely not. I have to say, almost tragically not. There was a cabinet meeting today chaired by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it devolved into kind of almost just embarrassing attacks back and forth from the national military leadership to ministers. The Prime Minister proposed giving this war, which Israelis just call the October 7th War, a grandiose new name, the War of Resurrection, as if that would change anything. The minister in charge of the official ceremony, which is just a pre-taped kind of event with no public present, asked to change the name of her ceremony to make it sound grander. And it's just been a very, I would say, heartbreaking day of I would say the bulk of the Israeli people feeling not represented by the government that represents them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the War of Resurrection, ask you what you think Prime Minister Netanyahu meant by that. He went on to say that the situation now is changing the security reality in our region for the sake of our children, for the sake of our future, to ensure that what happened on the 7th of October is never going to happen again. Is there a feeling that he's achieving or achieved any of that during the last 12 months?
There isn't. And it's a great question because it's a remarkable reality here in Israel. You know, the last 2 weeks or so have actually seen some very important tactical successes for the Israeli army with the elimination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and other hits against Hezbollah. And yet Israelis 70%, according to the latest polls, fear more for their security, do not feel safe. And there's a sense that, for example, with the Prime Minister's effort to give the war a grand name, he's trying to make believe that the horrors of October 7th didn't actually happen, and that the insecurity, the ongoing insecurity of Israelis isn't taking place. I'll give you a clear example. The more or less 100,000 Israelis who were evacuated from the north of Israel, next to the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah has been lobbing missiles since October 8th, they have no path back home, despite these tactical successes. So they are feeling a sort of ongoing desperation, and the mood of the country reflects that.
Yeah, and all the while, lots of speculation about how Israel might respond to last Tuesday's ballistic missile attack that was carried out by Iran. What are people expecting in terms of timing and also the nature of the counterattack? Or do you think perhaps people just aren't talking about it because today is, of course, the 7th of October?
I think that if we're talking about people with government connections, there's a lot of speculation here in Jerusalem. I think if we're talking about average Israelis, they just have no idea. And the government intentionally is not communicating with them. It's not just a matter of kind of the fog of war, and what the Israeli army spokesman clearly says is that they don't want to communicate any important information to the enemy. It's also a matter of a government that appears not to have a clear strategy. And so Israelis are left trying to pick up hints from foreign media reports. For example, CNN just reported in the last hour that Israeli officials have told American officials that they're determined to try and go after one of Iran's nuclear facilities. But again, even when that news is transmitted to Israelis, it's not in the context of any known endpoint or any actual strategy or any clear aim that the government is attempting to achieve through these actions.
Yeah, we've heard that quite a bit on this channel. We've had a number of analysts saying, you know, Israel's got the tactics, but where's the strategy? Just going back to today's commemoration, so it was on this day last year at exactly 6:29 a.m. that those Hamas attacks began. What's been happening, if anything, in Gaza to commemorate this first anniversary of what's been a hellish 12 months for them as well?
That's right. Today was another hellish day, or a repetition of hellish days for Gazans. Israel launched pretty heavy attacks in Gaza today. And, you know, what the Israeli army explains is that they're doing so against efforts by Hamas to regroup, which seem to be true. For Gazans, I think at this point, it doesn't matter. And to my knowledge, there weren't any actual commemorations. I'm not sure that in Gaza there was the space to organize any real events. But again, part of the reason that Israelis feel insecurity is that Hamas, after a year of being pounded by what's considered one of the most powerful armies of the Middle East, is able to regroup and reassert itself. It too launched rockets into Israel today. And there are a lot of questions about the Israeli government's no, no, and no. In other words, not wanting the Palestinian Authority to rule in the future in Gaza, not wanting even a joint Arab force there. And so there are questions of, you know, here as internationally wondering, what do you want if this is no and that is no? And there's a fear that Hamas can regroup because of Israel dithering in this way.
And is there any update on the situation regarding Yahya Sinwar? Anything we're hearing with regards to him?
Well, Al Arabiya had an important scoop in this respect this evening, saying that he is alive and after a few weeks of being AWOL, has actually made contact with other Hamas officials in Qatar. What I heard just minutes ago from the Israeli news site, Walla News, is an Israeli, anonymous, but an Israeli source confirming that, in fact, the understanding is that Sinwar is alive and back in touch with the mediators.
Okay, yes, indeed, that's what we've been hearing. Well, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest there. Journalist Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Described by the Israeli president as the country's darkest hour, the events of the 7th of October shook the nation of almost 10 million people to the core and sparked a conflict that continues to reverberate right across the region. Well, as Israel commemorates the first anniversary of the Hamas attacks, our very own Trent Murray takes a look back at the fateful day and the 12 months of war that have followed.
October 7th, 2023, 6:30 a.m. The first sirens sound across Jerusalem. Hamas unleashes a barrage of more than 2,000 missiles towards Israel. The warnings quickly spread to Ashkelon, Ashdod and Tel Aviv. Armed militants breach Gaza's perimeter fence, fanning out to nearby Israeli towns and villages. Local security forces are caught unprepared, and more than 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, are killed in the dark hours that follow. Hamas terrorists have waged the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust.
Citizens of Israel, we are at war, not in an operation or in fighting rounds, but at war.
Over 250 Israeli hostages are taken back into Gaza by the militants. Their desperate families watch anxiously as the IDF mobilizes to respond to the attack. Israeli fighter jets quickly begin to launch retaliatory strikes in Gaza as tanks and troops mass on the border.
We are afraid. We left afraid. I swear I cannot walk. I cannot walk one step, but we are afraid. May God protect them and us.
The IDF intensifies its attack on Gaza, striking what it says are Hamas targets in the Strip. As the death toll quickly climbs into the thousands, Israeli tanks pour into Gaza on October 28. Intense fighting and aerial bombardment continue until November 22, when the Israeli cabinet approves a temporary ceasefire in return for hostages. 105 captives are released over the 4-day truce, but the ceasefire collapses and the bombing begins again. Over the 12 months of Israeli bombardment, over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, according to the health ministry. It's a scale of killing which has shocked the world. Protests calling for a ceasefire spread, and away from Gaza, Israel's military responds with force against members of the self-described Axis of Resistance, assassinating Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, Hezbollah General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, and senior IRGC officers in Damascus. The United Nations calls for calm.
The raging fires in the Middle East are fast becoming an inferno.
Large-scale attacks spread to Lebanon in September as Israel targets Hezbollah. Bombs hit the capital and Israeli troops cross into southern Lebanon. A response, the IDF says, to more than 8,500 rocket attacks since October 8. But even after 12 months of death and destruction, worries remain that more may be yet to come. In the wake of the most recent Iranian missile attack, even 12 months on from October 7, the road ahead shows little sign of an off-ramp to de-escalate the tensions which are simmering across the Middle East. Trent Murray in Tel Aviv for Al Arabiya News.
Trent Murray reporting there. Well, let's get some more analysis now with Khaled Elgindy, who is a senior fellow and director of the program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute. You're also the author of the book Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. Thank you so much for speaking to us. 365 days have passed since the Hamas attacks. In your view, is Israel a safer country than it was 12 months ago?
I don't think so. I'm sure if you ask Israelis, they probably would say that they're not safer today than they were on October 6th, let's say, of 2023. And that's certainly true of the region as a whole. The region is more violent, more unstable, and closer to all-out regional war than at any time in recent memory. So I think there is a real fear about what comes next.
Indeed, and we were just talking about that with a correspondent on the ground in Jerusalem. This broader regional conflict would obviously, wouldn't it, pose a real threat to the US interests in the regions, and also by extension Israel having a great deal of anger in its backyard.
Oh, absolutely, and I think, you know, just as as we heard from the previous guest, there really isn't much thinking as far as strategic vision for what comes next. I mean, the Israelis are masters of tactics, as we heard, but give very little thought to the day after or even the next day. So here we are with Gaza in ruins, 42,000 people at least killed, massive collective trauma inflicted on Palestinians as a whole, starvation as a result of Israeli policies, the destruction of most of Gaza's infrastructure. It's hard to imagine how anyone, any sort of right-minded person would imagine that anything good could come out of this scale of human misery and destruction.
And it really feels, doesn't it, like diplomacy has completely failed for us to be where we are with, let's face it, there hasn't been anything resembling a truce or a ceasefire in Gaza at any rate since November of last year, has there?
That's right. I mean, there's been virtually no pause in the bombing campaign and the attacks on everything in Gaza. I mean, there is nothing that is safe. Just over the weekend, we saw yet another shelter that was bombed in an area that was supposed to be a safe zone by Israel. So there's really nothing and no one that is safe. And it is, I think, a massive diplomatic failure. I think it is a political failure, certainly on the part of extremists on both sides, Hamas and the Israeli government, but also on the part of the United States, which also doesn't really have a plan for the day after and does not really have a vision beyond its unconditional support and standing by Israel. They have, I think, what we've seen over the last year is the administration's been very frustrated, but they've been totally unwilling to translate that frustration into any meaningful pressure on Israel. And so here we are, a full year into this horror that is spreading with no end in sight.
Okay, so a failure on the part of the United States and US diplomacy here. But I think you've been, if I'm not mistaken, you've been critical of the Palestinian leadership as well, describing them in the August edition of Foreign Affairs as impotent and irrelevant. Well, at least that's how you describe Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership. Where have they been, and why haven't they played a more significant role in trying to lobby their friends around the world?
Well, because they don't really have any leverage. They're not in control of ceasefire talks, so they have nothing to do with the actual war itself. They are themselves under enormous pressure from the Israeli army. In the past several weeks, Israel has mounted a massive military crackdown on the population, particularly in the northern part of the West Bank. And so once again, the Palestinian Authority has shown itself to be kind of irrelevant, and those kinds of things undercut their credibility, which is already quite low among ordinary Palestinians. So they're not able to affect events on the ground in Gaza, in the diplomatic realm, and they're also really not able to confront the challenges facing Palestinians, even in their own backyard in the West Bank.
And presumably where you are in the United States, all of this is looming pretty large over the forthcoming elections, which are just a month away now. Would you say, on the whole, this has been more damaging for the Democrats than it's likely to be for Donald Trump? Has this played into Donald Trump's hands, this whole situation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, the party that is in power, the party that is in control, will be blamed for any successes or failures. And this has been a resounding diplomatic, political, moral failure on the part of this administration. And there's no question that it will probably hurt Kamala Harris's chances, particularly in key states where there are large Arab American communities, like Michigan. Whether it's enough to actually make a difference in the outcome of the election, that remains to be seen. But there's no doubt that there's an enormous gap between where the Biden and Harris administration and the party leadership are on this issue and where the rank and file membership of ordinary Democrats more broadly are on this issue. Most people who identify as Democrats in the United States would like to see more pressure on Israel, would like to see a cutoff of weapons used to kill Palestinians. But that's not at all where the Democratic Party is, either in terms of the donor class or the decision makers. It's certainly not where President Biden is. And so, again, it's hard to know exactly what that gap will mean. Most people don't vote on the basis of foreign policy, but there is a segment of the electorate, particularly the Arab American and American Muslim communities, who say, by pretty wide margins, I think I saw a poll by the Arab American Institute, 81% of Arab Americans say that Gaza is a primary issue in their decision of who to vote for in November.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. We're out of time, I'm afraid. Khaled Elgindy, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we can speak now to Daniel Lifshitz, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Daniel, you're the grandson of the hostage Oded Lifshitz, and your grandfather has been held now for exactly 1 year. He's 84 years old. Today must be a really painful day for you and your family, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not only me and my family, it's my community of Kibbutz Nir Oz. It's a community of people who all their life cherish for peace activism, for the coexistence, for doing everything for humanity. That's kind of a person is my grandfather. And I tell you the truth, I could never, ever imagine an 84 years old great-grandfather, he's the only great-grandfather held hostage in the world, will be held by Hamas, ISIS in Gaza for a year. I mean, I never imagined who will kidnap such an old people, but a year in Gaza, I never believed we'd get there.
Your grandfather was a journalist, I believe. Tell us a bit more about him, because the Palestinian cause was very close to his heart, wasn't it?
Absolutely. First of all, he founded the kibbutz in 1957. And after that, he had very good relationships all the years with the Palestinians, which are just a mile in front of the kibbutz, mile away. He was a journalist. He was the first Israeli journalist to interview Yasser Arafat. And actually, his biggest activity was that in 1984, he came to Gaza with Latif Dori to Rashad Ashawa, the leader at that time, to tell them, you have to focus on education. My grandfather for 20 years worked that they will focus on education because he said Oslo agreements are fine. The connection with Yasser Arafat is important, but education is the basic thing. And after Hamas took the leadership in Gaza, it was really a huge breakout for him because he couldn't go there anymore. And the only thing that he did since then was to take sick Gazans to the hospitals in Israel to get chemotherapy and bring them back there. That was this kind of man, you know, he's a man of justice, doing the right thing. And he really tried to do everything that these two nations can be together, but also he all the time warned that the enemy of the Middle East is Hamas, all the time. And unfortunately, he was right.
And he was actually helping people from Gaza at the very moment he was abducted, wasn't he? Tell us a bit about the circumstances of his abduction, Daniel.
So actually on October 7 at 8:15 in the morning, they were the first ones to be kidnapped, my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather stood up. He closed the bomb shelter door. He was holding the handle. He told my grandmother, Yochke, I'm afraid there is war. And then 5 Hamas terrorists breached their home. They shot 5 bullets on their door. They opened it. He got injured in his hand. They took my grandmother out of bed. They rolled her in a carpet and put her on a bike while my grandfather was dragged. And on the time that he was dragged, he was taken to he was just by the house, laying down there, and he was he faint because he have a blood pressure issues, and then my grandmother thought that he died. My grandmother thought that he was murdered, and she thought that he murdered on October 7, but then we realized that it was not true because he was taken, and another hostage that saw him, he said that she saw him inside Gaza in a storage of fruits and vegetables, and on that place with the fruits and vegetables, he was on the table bleeding with a white galabia, and they took him for a treatment to take out a bullet out of his hand. Then 2 days after, she asked, what about him? They said that he's in an apartment in Gaza. And another hostage that came back in the first deal, she told us that my grandfather was with her for 30 days. He helped her. He changed diapers for her. He did everything for her in a place they didn't get any medicine, any medication at all. After 30 days, he fainted. She was handicapped. So she told the Hamas captives, you have to take me to another place. I can't be alone. And they took her to another place. And since then, we have no information about him because we have no one been released since then. And my grandfather, I mean, you know, a holy thing for the Quran, for the Judaism, for any kind of religion. The old men are so precious, and he is still there, which all his life believed in peace, and now a year. And I'm really devastated from that.
Well, we wish you and your family well. And of course, we wish your grandfather, Oded Lifshitz, a prompt release. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Daniel Lifshitz, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Since last month, Israel has expanded its focus to include Lebanon, where the Israeli Air Force has conducted massive strikes on Hezbollah strongholds. Well, during the last 24 hours alone, there have been reports of extensive aerial bombardment across southern Lebanon and in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Well, for more, we can cross to Beirut and speak to Gareth Browne, who is the Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Gareth, Hezbollah fired an estimated 135 projectiles into Israel today. It was reported earlier as well that an Israeli strike had killed 10 Lebanese firefighters on the ground near the town of Barashit. Just tell us a little bit more about the situation on the ground there in Lebanon today.
Well, it seems to be escalating on an almost hourly basis, as you mentioned. Overnight late on Sunday, we had the 10 firefighters, rescue workers killed in an airstrike on a fire station in the south. And we've had this really what is an expansion of the war's geographical areas. We've seen an increasing number of strikes, not just in the southern suburbs of Beirut, but in other parts of Beirut too, and across the south. And I think, the most notable indication that the war is expanding is barely an hour ago, the IDF essentially issued warnings saying it was going to launch operations off the coast of South Lebanon, and it's warned, locals to stay away from the coast, stay away from the beach, up to the Awali River just south of Saida, which essentially cuts off about a third of the country from the rest of Lebanon. So every day, every hour that passes, this war is expanding geographically. The strikes are becoming more intense. We're seeing more people killed now, 2,000, well over 2,000 people dead. So, for all Israel's talk of a limited incursion, a limited ground invasion, that's not really how it feels in Beirut.
Yeah, a lot of people will be feeling that. Excuse me. There was a strike on a village in just outside Beirut on Sunday. 7 people were killed, including 3 children. I think it was in the town by the name of Kamatie. That must really raise fears, doesn't it, about how targeted these strikes really are?
I think this is a fear you hear from a lot of Lebanese. Some will use the term the Gazification of the war here, and you do see an increasing number of strikes killing civilians. That there's no way around it. That's the reality. I think if you go back a few weeks, we obviously were in what seemed like a different aerial campaign, and that was very targeted and very precise. Obviously, the strike that took out Hassan Nasrallah was the most notable example. But on an almost daily basis, Israel was taking out very senior Hezbollah commanders and officials. And now it seems as they go down the target list, as they strike people off, some of the targets are more questionable. We've had strikes on medical centers, the strike on that fire station in the south I just mentioned earlier. So this is a question that the Lebanese are asking themselves, and what can they do about it? It's not clear. I think we're probably likely to see, a greater displacement of people in the coming days and weeks, especially if the IDF continues to issue these statements saying, get out of this area, we're about to attack, as they've just done with the coast south of Saida. So I think if you're a Lebanese, this war is going in all the wrong directions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you mentioned Hassan Nasrallah is dead. We've known he's been dead for more than a week now. And yet Hezbollah, without a leader, it would appear, is continuing to function undeterred. I mean, who is calling the shots? Do we know?
We don't know for sure. I mean, this was always one of Hezbollah's strengths, right? It's secrecy, it's discipline. Clearly, Hassan Nasrallah has built a system which is going to outlive him. Think of the equivalent of the civil service. If you killed the head of the civil service, the state would largely keep functioning. I don't think Hezbollah are in a rush to name a successor, a new secretary general. And they've essentially said that, the movement is being run effectively by committee. What remains of the leadership is running it in coordination with one another. I don't think there's any rush to name a new secretary general. I mean, the obvious issue there is if you name a successor and they are taken out, then that asks serious questions. It could be weeks, even months before we see a new secretary general of Hezbollah named. And we haven't had Nasrallah's funeral as well, which is going to be a very important moment, not just for Hezbollah, but for all of Lebanon. It will be a big moment of mourning. It'll likely be a huge public demonstration. Now, for obvious reasons, because of the war, because of Israel's aerial campaign, that's not possible at the minute. And, Hezbollah sources have said that Nasrallah has essentially been temporarily buried in secret. So I think Hezbollah are abiding their time. But what we see now is in the south, in the southern villages, Hezbollah's fighters are putting up quite a fierce fight. Some of the firefights are really quite tremendous. And we're seeing an organization that for now is outliving the charismatic Nasrallah.
And in terms of diplomacy and what's happening behind the scenes with a view to either brokering a ceasefire or bringing about an end to this aspect of Israel's war, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot was in Israel today, and just looking and listening to what's coming out of Paris, I mean, it does feel, doesn't it, like France is sort of forging its own diplomatic path and slightly going it alone from the rest of the international community.
Yeah, I don't think that's particularly new. I mean, I think when it comes to Lebanon, France has quite a distinguished history here. And I think the French knowledge of Lebanon is probably better than most other Western states. And you have seen, I think, over the last year or so, this almost a rivalry. You had the US peace efforts, which were, being driven by Amos Hochstein, President Biden's energy advisor. And then you had this French effort. And they were similar, but they were not exactly the same, and they were not exactly aligned. And I think you've seen, especially since, the pager attack here in Beirut a few weeks ago and Nasrallah's assassination, this pretense of US-led diplomacy has really started to fall away. And perhaps there is opportunity. I mean, I think the French feel capable, and they feel like they have a responsibility to Lebanon, and they also have close links to Israel, to the Israelis. So I think there is an opportunity for French diplomacy. But generally speaking, I think if you look at how the war is expanding, you feel the atmosphere in Beirut. Nobody is pinning their hopes on a diplomatic solution here. It feels very, very far away from the reality on the ground. That doesn't mean it might not come up with something, but I think if you're a Lebanese on the streets of Beirut, you're not holding your breath, waiting to see if this French diplomacy is going to deliver anything.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, I'm told. That Gareth Browne, Middle East correspondent for The Economist, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's get a reminder of our stories here on Al Arabiya News. Marking the first anniversary of the 7th of October attacks, the US President Joe Biden today condemned what he called the unspeakable brutality of what happened. He said he remains committed to Israel's right to defend itself. His Vice President Kamala Harris, meanwhile, added to the statement expressing heartbreak over the scale of death and destruction in Gaza during the past year. According to a report, the US has spent a record amount on military aid to Israel during the past year. The report from Browne University says Washington's expenditure of at least $17.9 billion has led to what it called an escalating conflict around the Middle East. And the Wall Street Journal says the Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, who was released by the US as part of a prisoner swap 2 years ago, is now back in the arms trade. Well, the newspaper reported that he's been trying to broker the sale of weapons to Yemen's Houthi militants, but the Kremlin has called that story fake news. Just before we leave you, the headlines here on Al Arabiya News. On the 1-year anniversary of the 7th of October attacks, memorials have been held to honor the victims of that deadly assault. This as Hamas targets Tel Aviv with rockets. At least 9 Palestinian children are known to be among the 17 people killed after the Israeli military ordered civilians to flee the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza before carrying out airstrikes. And Israel has continued its bombardment of the Lebanese capital. This says Hezbollah has targeted Haifa. Well, that is all we have time for. Thank you for watching. See you very soon here on Al Arabiya News.